August 15th, 1945. For millions of Japanese soldiers, this date was the start of a new kind of war. On the radio, Emperor Hirohito's voice announced Japan's surrender, saying they had to bear the unbearable. In that moment, 3 million soldiers in torn uniforms, from the cold of Manchuria to the jungles of New Guinea, stopped fighting. They thought the war was over for good, but for most, the war just changed. It turned into a new kind of suffering, with constant hunger, cruel long marches, and years of being stuck, not knowing if their homes still existed. This is the story of those forgotten soldiers after the surrender. Their journey takes them to the freezing winters of Siberia, across the ocean on American hospital ships, into the middle of the Chinese Civil War, and finally back to a Japan that had changed so much it felt like a foreign country. Their story is messy, bloody, and sometimes very strange. The last soldier, who didn't believe the war was over, didn't go home until 1974. The Emperor's announcement stopped everything. It went against everything the soldiers had been taught their whole lives. For many, it was impossible to understand. How could their emperor, who they saw as a god, admit they had lost? Some officers killed themselves out of shame. Others just walked away into the jungle completely confused. It wasn't just a military surrender, it was a mental and emotional breakdown. In Manchuria, for example, whole groups of soldiers kept their guns ready for 3 days. They believed the radio broadcast was a trick by the enemy. They had been told to fight until the last man and never give up. When they finally understood the truth, the powerful Imperial Japanese army fell apart. It became scattered groups of hungry and lost men. Around 1.6 million soldiers were stuck in China, 700,000 were across Southeast Asia, 500,000 were on remote islands, 300,000 were lost in the Pacific, and another 300,000 were in the path of the Soviet army. They had no food, no orders, no way to get home, and no idea what would happen. The only thing they knew for sure was that their captors would decide if they lived or died. It was a scary and uncertain time for millions. The Soviet leader, Stalin, had joined the war against Japan on August 8th. His army kept fighting and taking prisoners long after Japan's surrender on the 15th. Soviet soldiers moved quickly through Manchuria, capturing about 600,000 Japanese soldiers in a few weeks. What happened to them was like a game of chance. Some were put on old, shaky trains and sent deep into the harsh lands of the Soviet Union. Others had to walk for weeks or months across empty, frozen plains. The temperature dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. Sickness spread quickly, killing many. The guards gave them only a tiny amount of bread each day and told them, "Work hard and you go home soon." For most, soon meant 11 long and difficult years. Diaries from survivors described terrible conditions, working 12-hour days in uranium mines or in logging camps where getting frostbite meant losing a limb. They also had to go to political classes. These classes were a planned way to break their will and turn them into supporters of the Soviet Union. By 1949, about 60,000 prisoners had died from the cold, hunger, or from being shot. The Soviet government wanted to keep this story secret for a long time. When the trains finally brought them home in 1956, many were missing. Only about 400,000 men returned. They brought back things like guitars made from wood, blindness caused by poor food, and for some, a new and worrying belief in communism. This new belief made them outcasts in their own hometowns in Japan. The Japanese government still works to bring back the remains of those who died in the Soviet camps, a sign of the deep scar this left on the country. At the same time, the US Navy had a different but equally huge problem: how to send 3.5 million former enemies home quickly to avoid riots and hunger. The solution was called Operation Magic Carpet. It was something that had never been done before. From Okinawa to the Philippines, the Navy put former soldiers on any ship available, including aircraft carriers and cargo ships. These ships were quickly painted white with a red cross to show they were on a mission to help people. The rules were simple: no weapons, cleaning with a powder to kill lice, and a good diet of 2,400 calories a day, much better than the Soviet rations. The goal was to get them to Japan before the winter storms started. The American naval authority in charge was amazingly efficient, and most of the soldiers were home by mid-1946. Compared to the terrible conditions in Siberia, the American camps were like a vacation. There were hot meals, doctors, and even baseball equipment to fight boredom. Still, it was a strange change for the soldiers. They had been taught to be warriors and expected to be killed. Instead, they got English lessons and letters from home. By mid-1946, almost all of them had passed through the return center in Yokohama. They were given a train ticket, a clean new uniform, and about $5 in special money used by the American forces. The average soldier was there for only 37 days. Was this America showing off its kindness, or was it a smart plan? It was likely a mix of both. America wanted a stable Japan, and a large group of jobless, hungry ex-soldiers could have caused more problems. In places like Singapore and Java, Japanese soldiers surrendered to the British. The British were very careful to follow the rules of war. This was partly because they needed workers to rebuild their colonies, and partly because they wanted to show they were in control. So, the Japanese prisoners were put to work building airfields and fixing docks. Their food was simple but enough to keep them healthy, which was very different from how many Allied prisoners had been treated by the Japanese. The Dutch in Indonesia had a more difficult problem. The country was demanding freedom, and they didn't want Japanese soldiers working for their old colonial rulers. In a brilliant move, the Dutch let Japanese experts work for the Indonesian freedom fighters, but under Allied watch. This led to the very strange sight of former Japanese officers training the same people they once fought against. Australian camps in places like New Guinea had stricter rules, with daily roll calls and classes the prisoners had to attend. They were made to write essays with titles like "Why We Lost." This was a planned effort to change how they thought about the war. But even in these simple and strict conditions, people found ways to be human. One camp even held a poetry contest. The poems were later published in a book that became popular in 1948, showing how art can survive even in hard times. China had suffered a great deal during the war and was holding about 1.2 million Japanese soldiers. The nationalist leader, Chiang Kai-shek, had two urgent needs: soldiers to fight the communists led by Mao, and a way to show that he could change the enemy. So, instead of prisons, he set up re-education groups. In the morning, soldiers listened to talks about democracy. In the afternoon, they rebuilt the railways and roads they had once destroyed as a way of making up for what they did. Their food was very simple: 1 rice ball, 3 pickles, and green tea. But when the Chinese Civil War started again with great force, the situation changed completely. Both the nationalists and the communists needed skilled soldiers. The communist armies offered Japanese doctors and artillery experts better food and a chance to survive if they joined them. Thousands did, and some even fought in very important battles for Mao's army. At the same time, some former Japanese officers were training pilots for the nationalist army. This meant that Japanese soldiers were now helping both sides of the Chinese Civil War fight each other. It was a bitter and unexpected outcome. By 1949, when the communists were winning, only about 100,000 Japanese soldiers were left. The new government sped up the process of sending them home, partly to strengthen their control and partly to get rid of proof that foreigners had helped them win. While most soldiers wanted to go home, a small, stubborn group became like a legend. These were the holdouts, men who refused to believe the war was over. One of them was Hiroo Onoda, an officer in the Philippines. He kept fighting a one-man war until 1974 because his last order was never cancelled. More of these soldiers who wouldn't give up hid in the jungles of islands like Guam and Saipan. Local villagers, often frustrated, would leave out food and notes that said, "War over, please come down." Their refusal to give up became a famous story. Some held out because they were afraid of the shame of losing. Others never got the news or thought the flyers announcing the surrender were a complex trick by the enemy. For them to finally give up, it often took a former commanding officer, now in a business suit instead of a uniform, to go into the jungle and officially cancel their old orders. In 1974, Onoda's old boss, Major Taniguchi, flew from Tokyo to do just that. When Onoda finally gave up his rifle, which still worked, he cried. He said he was crying for the 29 years he had lost fighting a war that was already over. It is a powerful story of strong loyalty, but also a deep misunderstanding. By 1947, trains began bringing soldiers back to Tokyo. The city was now full of black markets and American neon signs. The emotional damage of their return was terrible. Many of their families had been told they were dead. Wives who thought their husbands had died had married other men. Family farms had been given to others or lost. The government wanted to move on from the war. It called the soldiers demobilized persons instead of veterans, on purpose taking away their respected title. This meant they got no retirement money, no health care, and no official thanks for their sacrifice. People gave them the nickname ghost soldiers. They were alive, but were unwanted reminders of a loss Japan wanted to forget. Many desperately looked for work, rebuilding railways or shoveling coal. Others, lost and disappointed, joined gangster gambling groups, where their war scars became sad signs of their past. A serious health study in 1951 showed the human cost. Many had diseases like tuberculosis, stomach problems, and almost all reported always feeling guilty. The number of suicides among returning soldiers went up, reaching its highest point in 1953. It was a sad and ironic situation because that was the year Japan's economy started to get better. The lucky ones found jobs in new and growing companies like Sony or Toyota, whose founders cared more about hard work than a person's military past. But at every company party, someone would always pour a drink for the friends who never came back. Between 1946 and 1948, an international court for war crimes, known as the Tokyo Trials, put 28 of Japan's top leaders on trial. Thousands of other soldiers faced smaller trials across Asia for many terrible acts. For some former prisoners of war watching, this felt like justice they had waited a long time for. For others, it felt like a few people were being blamed for everyone's mistakes. Back in Japan, the argument over who was responsible for the war caused deep divisions in families and society. Some people argued that the military leaders had failed the country. Others claimed that soldiers were just following the emperor's orders honorably. This conflict led to Japan forgetting its past on purpose. Schoolbooks in the 1950s avoided talking about difficult topics like the Nanjing massacre. This created a deep silence that lasted for many years. At the same time, the soldiers who returned from the Soviet Union, many of whom had been taught to believe in communism, formed groups to promote friendship with Moscow. The fact that they existed was embarrassing to a government that wanted to show off its economic success, not ex-prisoners with communist ideas. Japan's public memory became carefully chosen. Movies made kamikaze pilots seem like romantic heroes. But the real survivors of the terrible prison camps in Siberia were mostly unseen, and their stories were pushed aside. By the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, which showed Japan's amazing recovery after the war, most veterans had started new lives one way or another. They were now office workers, shopkeepers, or union leaders. But there was still a missing group of people in the country's population. The 2.3 million soldiers who died meant that millions of children were never born. The economy grew quickly, but the birth rate was low. It was not until the 1970s that people started to talk about the past. A comic book called Barefoot Gen, a story about the Hiroshima bombing, sold over 10 million copies. It made people talk about the war and made children ask their families what really happened. The forgetting was slowly and painfully being challenged. Today, there are memorials at former prison camp sites in Russia, Australia, and New Zealand. Japanese tour groups visit these sites and leave paper cranes as symbols of peace. In a strange way, remembering has become a kind of tourism. But every so often, an old man who returned from Siberia still wakes up in the middle of the night, his heart racing, thinking he hears a guard yelling "Appell," the German word for roll call. It's a scary reminder of a past that won't go away. Even in the 1990s, the story of the holdouts was not over. In 1997, a 76-year-old man named Shoichi Yokoi was found in a cave on the island of Guam. He had survived on frogs and coconuts with pure determination for 28 years. He had no idea the war had ended decades ago. When the police asked him why he never tried to escape, he gave a simple but deep reply: "We Japanese do not surrender until ordered." His words became a popular saying all over Japan, but Yokoi himself lived a quiet life and turned down offers to make a lot of money from his story. He explained his experience with one sad and meaningful sentence: "It is shameful to survive when so many did not." He died in 2003. That same year, the government finally set aside money for a national peace archive, a step that should have been taken long ago. His cave is now a protected historical site visited by school children. They leave notes that say, "Thank you for teaching us the value of peace." It is still an important question whether they are really learning the lesson or just a cleaned-up version of history. The journey of Japanese soldiers after the war was not one single story. It was a large, complicated mix of being captured, of refusing to give up, and of difficult and sad homecomings. About 1 in every 10 soldiers never returned to Japan. Thousands who did come back were scarred for life, carrying the physical and mental wounds of their experience. Their suffering even changed the Japanese language, where the word for Siberia is still sometimes used to mean a terrible, difficult experience. But in the middle of all the pain, there were surprising and touching human moments. There were baseball games in American camps, poetry contests in Australian camps, and even Soviet guards who would trade bread for paper cranes. So, what happened to the Japanese soldiers after World War II? They became prisoners, workers, and pieces in other countries' wars. In a few strange cases, they became like people from another time, trapped by their refusal to quit. Their story does not have a simple lesson. Instead, it shows a deep truth. War does not end when the fighting stops. It just continues in a different way, inside people's minds and memories. The longest and most difficult fight for a soldier is not on the battlefield. It's the fight they face after the war to win back their reputation, their self-respect, and their place in a peaceful world.